And the truth of the matter is, we are people, if we understood the power of our resilience, we could heal our pain. Right? We have given the pain too much attention because we're angry that we ever had to endure it. You know, but the power really of us even being dispersed throughout the diaspora. I'm getting to the place now where I'm really beginning to believe that the ancestors, even through this this unbelievable moment called the Middle Passage, the ancestors were sending us into the world to humanize this planet. But we did not volunteer to go. But there are elements of the magnificence of human existence which dwelled in Africa alone. You know, you wouldn't have gotten jazz without us. You know, there would have been no gospel music. You know, quite frankly, there'd be no NFL either. But, you know, NBA, do we need to go on and on? You know. So the real truth is, I feel like the ancestors were saying to me, you absolutely must, through the power of the pen, you must force the people to recognize the magnitude of their story. Because the magnitude of the story includes the healing of it. God doesn't call us unto a thing that welcomes us. God calls us unto a thing that God wants to be transformed. Whether it seeks transformation or not. If God wants the transformation, God will call someone who is willing to do the work. But God doesn't ask anyone's permission to be changed. Right? God just sends the change agent. And the effect happens. I believe, and I come from a people who believe that God doesn't even negotiate with you when God calls you. God just puts it before you and God beckons. And you can say no, and God will just worry the hell out of you. You know,
till you write this book.
That's right.
And that's the one that you're trying to write.
Exactly. Because, you know, I was writing this, when this came to me, I was writing this in the morning and listening to the Lambs at night.
Wow.
So I was literally doing 2 novels at once. It was more than a notion. It was more than anything I would ever recommend unto any human being.
Talk to me about process, right? Because you said it takes more than a notion. This book is historical fiction. This book has historical specificity. This book is marked with so much nuanced understanding of the African Holocaust.
Yes, sir.
You can't just write this. Talk to me about your intellectual process. But also talk to me about your spiritual and psychological process. Because, and we're going to talk about a few more of these things, there's some stuff in this book that was tough for me to read.
Sure.
I couldn't imagine being a spiritual conduit for so much pain, so much misery, so much unrest, without some kind of journey. So talk to me about the not just the nuts and bolts writing, but the spiritual, the intellectual, psychological journey you had to take to get something out like this.
Yes, sir. I have to admit that I almost hate that you asked me that, because I'd probably rather not talk about it. But I suppose it must be. I think the first thing is, this book is absolutely a spiritual undertaking. And every day when I wrote this book, I poured a libation before I started every morning. And I sat on my couch, and I leaned back, and I took a moment of Sankofa, and I went back in time and lay among my people on those ships. Right? I had to be on the boat before I could write. Right? It would not come to me. Not a word would come to me unless I was on the boat.
So every day you had to get back on that boat.
Every day. I had to get on that boat every day. And many times the boat was metaphorically my couch. And I remember even times I have a young man who I'm mentoring, who was saying to me at the time, and there are times when he would tap me on the shoulder, "Hey, Papa, you all right? You all right?" Because I would be rocking.
Yeah.
Right? But I'm on the ship. Wow. You know. But also the laptop is in my lap. Right? So I'm writing, and some of the words, of course, were misspelled, and some of my fingers were on the wrong letters and all of that. But, you know, I was able to fix that. But I had to go to the boat every day, literally every day. And I probably wept once a week. It was just the most grueling experience. But even as I'm talking about it now, I have a heaviness on my chest, and I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of that when I talk about this book.
Yeah.
You know, because it was just such an unbelievable undertaking. You know, there are stories in this book about even young men being sexually violated on the ship, and what their violation was like. You know, and as people, we have not told that story.
let's talk about that story for a second, because again, it was one of the more courageous parts of this book, particularly when we tell stories of Africa.
Right.
There are dimensions of our life and our experience,
right,
that get either negated, ignored, unrecognized, or misrepresented. Mm-hmm. You said occasionally young men too were thus violated. Mm-hmm. It's important to note that he said too. The chapter very much talks about sexual violence against women, but we sort of expected that. As horrific as it is, that wasn't a surprise to me as a reader. What was surprising to me as a reader was where you went when you said occasionally young men too were thus violated. They fought like cornered lions. It always took 3 or 4 crewmen to subdue one of our boys. Then, with his strength exhausted and pride wounded, he was dragged up the wooden stairs to the place of defilement. We heard his screaming each step of the way. It was a hollow kind of roar housed in a deep, innocent place. We saw in our minds his mouth stretched wide and eyes bulging. When he returned, his face was a blank stare. They threw him like a corpse into his holding place, and once again bound him with chains. We begged him not to surrender, but our words, we feared, were useless babbling. So we hummed some more until slowly, painfully, he cried, enjoying the chorus of protection for himself or another who screamed, wept, moaned, fought, and was still overcome in battle. Then we sighed, but then later on you say something else. As you described the peculiar odor, the smell of sexual violation, the mixture of rotting flesh and underarm stench. They shivered even though the heat below decks would have suffocated the weak. Our desecrated brothers survived because as best we could, we reminded them of who they were. Still, most were never the same again. Some never spoke another word. Some never married. Some couldn't look at a woman again, even their own mothers and sisters. Some wanted to touch and hold lovers, but their arms could not embrace. Some conceived thoughts too vile and heinous to repeat. Most considered their own destruction. One tender, beautiful brother, smothered with the captor's stench, dashed his head against his plank until we were sure his brains would spill into the floor. An older man turned and whispered something in his ear, restoring his life. The young man didn't understand his elder's words, but he heard his heart and he survived. Most were not so fortunate. That not only took me someplace there.
Yes, yes.
I couldn't help but connect that to the experience of sexual violence in the 21st century and everything in between.
Right.
Talk to me about why it was important for that to be there. I know this came through you, so I understand part of this you can't even fully talk about in that way. But to the extent that you can, why was this important? Why was that necessary? And what does it mean for us now?
Well, first,
to come to terms with that.
Sure. First, it's necessary because we have left this story out. You know, when we talk about slavery, when we talk about enslavement, when we talk about, you know, this whole antebellum period, I was telling a class, it's been so funny to me that to this day, there is no book on this subject of the sexual violation of men. Yeah. The book doesn't exist at all. And so I actually asked a very, very famous historian about this. I said, I must be missing something. There's no way this is not significant enough for us to write about. And this historian said, brother, everybody knows this happened. But most of us are not bold enough to pay the price of writing this book. And I said, the price? What are you talking about? This is just something that happened to us. And of course, as I got mature, I understood what he was saying. That, first of all, to write a book about the sexual violation of men, one is going to question, the author's own sexuality and sexual being, right? But I realized, so deep, God, I realized, too, how then I get chosen for that, right? It's, God help me. Because, you know, I'm a young man, too, whose sexuality has been questioned my whole life, you know. And the ironic thing is, I was a virgin for a long time. Right? But the point was that the ancestors in this case ended up choosing someone who had already paid the price, so that the various prices would not get in the way of telling the narratives. Right? And so, you know, there's no new price to pay. You know, I didn't know that they had forced me to pay up front. You know, I didn't know that. I didn't understand that then. I didn't get that then. You know, and I think this is also important because very, very often when you're dealing with issues of sex, of anyone in sexual violation, we are a country who blames the victim. Right. And so we don't really even understand how to examine this notion of sexuality and sexual violation. Or we don't even understand the difference between sex and gender.
Right.
You know, we conflate gender and sexuality as if it's one and the same. Yeah. As if anybody, you know, who's effeminate is also gay. But, you know, anybody, if you just say alive long enough, you know, that ain't true.
Right.
You know?